Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Leaders with Pride conversation. I'm Suki, Sandhu, and I'm the founder and CEO for Audeliss and Involve. For those of you that don't know, Audeliss is an executive search firm that levels the playing field for diverse talent, and Involve is an inclusion consulting firm that helps you be inclusive. And we're incredibly excited to be joined by four fabulous, incredible, amazing, phenomenal, all the adjectives that you can think of to describe them, panelists with me today. And I'm very privileged to call them friends. And we are here to celebrate Pride and talk about Pride. So I know we're going to have some very serious questions, but we do also want to have some fun. So, and we also want this to be incredibly interactive. So you've all got the chat function. Feel free to send your comments, your questions. My team is going to be fielding them, and I'm going to try and weave them into the conversation as we go. Now, if you haven't joined a virtual panel before, it's only an hour and it will fly by. We are finishing on the dot at 6 p.m, which means I'm going to get my panelists to be as concise as possible with their answers. I'm looking at you, Robert, and I want to make sure that we are going to get through as many of these topics because we've got lots of very important topics to talk about today. So I'm going to start doing the introductions and hand over to Keisha. I think we're going to start with her. And we're all going to say, we're going to do their intros, say their name, where they're based right now, their pronouns, and they're going to share a fun story about Pride. Over to you, Keisha.
Hello, everyone. This is Keisha Bell, Head of Diverse Talent Management and Advancement at DTCC. We are located in Jersey City, but currently, right now, I'm at home, like everyone else, and I'm in Westchester. Funny Pride story from last year, because obviously I'm not going anywhere this year, so happy Pride virtually. Funny story, last year, my wife and I always go to Pride. We imbibe, we dance, we party, we brunch, we lunch, we do all those things. And we were at a nice restaurant, sit-down, tapas place. I got up to go to the ladies' room and I hear this ruckus behind me. A Pink song was on, So What, which kind of gets people all riled up and roused. And I was like, what is happening? These people are so classless. What are they doing? They're partying in the club. And I turn around and there's my 6'1" blonde-haired wife, ponytail bouncing. She's the leader of the charge through the restaurant with like a conga line. I've never been more mortified, but I joined in after I came back from the ladies' room. So that's my Pride story from last year. Lots of fun.
We want you participating. That's what you need to do. Pedro, let's go to you. Okay, so we are live, everyone, and I feel like Eurovision now. That was quite poetic. So now we're going to go to Robert. Robert, intro, pronouns, and Pride story.
All right, Robert Hanson. I work for Constellation Brands based in San Francisco, but like Keisha, sheltering in place at the moment. So I happen to be in a very hot Palm Springs, California. I just got back yesterday from San Francisco, and my welcome home was getting skunked with my dog last night at 11 p.m. So I'm very lucky to be here. He, him, his. And my favorite Pride story, I'm going to actually tell you something about a smaller city that I enjoyed Pride in so much when I was living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which was a big change for me. It was so much fun because it was a much smaller and I would say more hard-fought Pride. But it attracted some incredible stars. So one of my favorite things was being able to be up on stage with Melissa Etheridge, getting my groove on at Pittsburgh Pride with all of my employees from a prior company. So that was a lot of fun, and that with my husband as well. So I really enjoyed that. And if it weren't for COVID, I'd be celebrating with my team in San Francisco like we did last year. We were in San Francisco Pride together, including Misty Kelly, who I know joined us today.
Fabulous. Thank you, Robert. Right, now I'm going to go to Lanaya. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Suki. Lanaya Irvin, preferred pronouns, they, them. I will also answer to she, her, hers. I'm in New York City. So we've been in quarantine for quite a while. I've been in this apartment for quite a while. Funny Pride story. Obviously, last year was a marathon, right, for many of us at the 50th. And I was in Nashville, one of the cities I was in. I was in Nashville, and it was the first time that they'd held a an actual Pride parade in many years. I don't know if it was a decade or something meaningful. They'd had one before, then, you know, it just stopped. And so, you know, you have your, you're walking down the down the honky tonk or that area. And I thought it was funny. The gays thought it was funny. But there was a point where we're, you know, cheering and it's all celebratory. And we see this family literally grab their children, like grab them as if, you know, we were just going to leave the parade trail and somehow damage their children's worldview or something of that nature. And we thought it was the funniest thing ever. So that was a funny story from last year. But yeah, if COVID didn't have us indoors, it would be a heavy rotation of drag brunches and garden parties, tea, and perhaps a fundraising like ball of some kind. So
I love a drag brunch.
Yeah.
I certainly do. Thank you, Lanaya. And now Pedro's back with us. Over to you, Pedro.
Hi, yeah. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Cool. All right. My name is Pedro. I work at Google. My day job is to handle the big relationship with Google with big global advertisers. But my gay job, my other job, is to lead all things LGBT for the region of Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and also executive responsible for all things diversity, for the strategy of diversity in the region. I respond to he, his, him, and last year, I was, of course, in 2 or 3 cities across the region because we do sponsor lots of prides and we have lots of floats. And so I have to be present in 2 or 3 typically. But I remember distinctly the one in London where I was just having fun, right, on the float. And I kept getting this call permanently from someone. I was like, who's calling? First of all, no one calls anyone these days. So who's calling me? And I said, hello. And then I had a family member on the other side say, I'm seeing you on TV. And I'm like, where? Because I don't know where. Somehow an image was being captured and was being streamed or something. And I was being seen. So that was funny. And it was my tiny little moment of
Fantastic.
Of celebrity. And if it was this year, I would of course be doing the same thing, strutting down through 2 or 3 cities in Europe and supporting our community in those cities.
Fantastic. Well, I was actually in New York last year for Pride, and I was on this trade mission with the UK Trade and Investment Department. They did for the first time a founders mission for LGBTQ founders. And also the fact that it was also World Pride meant that there were 3 times as many events. I mean, my team and I were trying to divide and conquer everything, including like this drinks reception in the British Embassy in Manhattan. It was pretty mental. But I have to say my highlight from the whole Pride celebrations in New York was Grace Jones. Very lucky to have tickets to see her perform live on the pier. And she, I mean, isn't she like 70? Like she was absolutely incredible. And to compare her with Madonna, who basically was like a tired drag queen, quite frankly, and I love Madonna, but Grace Jones, and don't at me in the comments, everyone, I know you probably all will because you all love Madonna, but Grace Jones killed it. That's all I'm going to say. So on to the questions, everyone. So I thought, obviously, given the fact we're talking about Pride, I mean, we have something pretty huge to celebrate in the US with the Supreme Court ruling around LGBTQ rights in the workplace across the US federally. So I'd love to find out your comments on that. But from my perspective, I was thinking, Pedro and I probably being in Europe are like, well, actually about time. We've had those protections in Europe and the UK for years. So I'd love to hear from some of the panelists in the US what they think. So Keisha, would you like to go first?
Sure. You know, I share your sentiment. It's about time, right? I think the celebratory mood here in the US is because the Supreme Court has definitely tilted towards the right. And so I personally did not expect this to pass. My company signed on to the amicus brief last year, not thinking it would get through this conservative court. So I am ecstatic. I'm glad, but I also don't want us to forget that there's still a portion of the LGBTQ plus population that is not covered by this legislation because I believe, or this law, because I believe it only protects companies that have 15 or more employees or larger companies. So there's a lot of small businesses out there that may not have to abide by this federal legislation. But I'm excited. I'm happy.
Yeah. Lanaya, anything that you'd add?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that there are. While it was a moment in history and a necessary piece of good news, given the current context and what we've all been going through, it's one of those things where we have to consider not only who's left out of this piece of legislation, but other protections that we definitely know, fundamentally need to be put in place in order for kind of LGBTQ plus populations to feel kind of safe and protected.
Yeah.
Many firms, many individuals at companies, I'm sure on the line who joined us today have signed on to the Business Coalition for the Equality Act. And obviously, I sit on the Human Rights Campaign's National Business Advisory Council, and I know that the Business Council has been championing that within our firms for the past several years. And so it's really great to see, this decision, perhaps a surprise from SCOTUS, but I do think that protections as it relates to LGBTQ people across all areas of life are really important. As it relates to housing, credit, public spaces, federally funded programs. I think there's still plenty of work to do.
Because there's one thing having the law protect you, or for LGBT communities, another thing how that feels when you're in a company. So Robert, I would love to hear, given the change of the law, what are there going to be changes happening in Constellation Brands? Like what's been the impact internally, I suppose, to the change in legislation?
Yeah, I think, look, Keisha and Lanaya covered the really salient points. I think we're thrilled, but at the same time, we have to recharge and take on the fight until all people are treated equally and have the same opportunity. So I think it's wonderful to celebrate, but because so many businesses in the US are small, there is that, 15 people or less issue that so many of our fellow LGBTQ peers are going to be working in companies where they're not protected. And I think it's really critical that we recognize that. And so at CBI, we have a really strong diversity and inclusion program. In fact, the topic that we had when we had a discussion with HRC, we've reviewed kind of LGBTQ history with all the employee base. I'm actually really proud to say that, each one of the conversations that we've held have been sold out. We can have up to about 1,000 people per event, and they've been sold out, which means a number of our allies have attended. And the number one question that has come up is, what can we do to help our peers that work for these small companies that aren't protected, and how can we continue to take on the challenge there? So I think we're going to be retooling and recharging and making sure that we have the most progressive policies possible that are welcoming to anybody that is an underrepresented group, but at the same time look at how we can partner, as Keisha's company did, in things like amicus brief, and continue to challenge the judicial system to make sure that Title VII is applied to every single person within the United States. And that's really the battle we need to take on.
Great, thank you. And staying on the whole politics theme, I suppose, we can see the current administration trying to erode trans rights in the US. And obviously there's an upcoming election coming up in November. And there are still communities, I hate saying it, but gays for Trump. And I'm very interested to get your perspective of how they can even vote for someone when they're trying to take your rights away. Strong question, and I'm going to give it to Pedro.
You caught me there. That is not the only group that surprises me.
Yeah.
And the only thing I could say is that those groups are single issued groups. Maybe they're hanging on to something else. Maybe they're part of a group that is incredibly privileged and is simply not understanding the wider agenda. Look, Suki, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. But as I said, Gays for Trump is not the only group that surprises me. There are wider groups that surprise me.
Anyone else have anything to add or say on that point?
In my opinion, right? People vote against their own best interests in history a lot. And I feel, Gays for Trump, you see sometimes 5 African Americans sprinkled into some rally, and I want to know who those people are, right?
Yeah.
Who are they?
Totally, yeah.
I think though for Gays with Trump, I think a lot of people, my identity, your identity, we have a hierarchy of identities, and I identify primarily as an African American woman, then lesbian, then and I think in a lot of those instances, people are voting based on their interests, their privilege, and maybe their race, right? It is to their benefit to align with the Trump framework or their Trump agenda, and the identification as white men or women as the benefactor of some of his policies, right? That's the only way that I can explain that, other than people are out of their minds.
Yeah, exactly.
The one thing that I would add which is I think shifting the focus toward hopefully a positive outcome, is I have been engaging quite broadly with Republicans, Libertarians, Green Party, Democrats, the very broad DI, my DI peer set. And I would say fundamentally, the choice is really rooted in values. And I see people of all political affiliations choosing values and a narrative which is about opportunity and security for all, and working hard to help the Democratic Party and and Vice President Biden's campaign mount a modern campaign to take on, not on his playing field, but in a modern way, which is leveraging social and digital media to fight that battle and putting out relevant content to each individual voter. It's going to come down to about 8 states and a limited number of people that can affect the change in the Electoral College. And it's a matter of us engaging very broadly and openly. I mean, to be honest, I've been encouraged by the Lincoln Project and the Midas Project, and the Never Republicans a very articulate defense of our democracy. I'm hoping that we can affect change.
Fingers crossed. I actually want to move on to the intersections of Pride with Black Lives Matter. So you have to have been on a different planet if you can't see what's been happening both sides of the ponds with the protests around the treatment of Black people in society and business and every walk of life. I'm gonna share a tweet I'm going to share my screen very briefly so that everyone can see it who's watching. Some people may have seen it, some people may have not. It may be upsetting for some people watching it, but I think it's really important that we have this conversation. So if you bear with me 1 second, I'm just going to do this. And can you all see that? You can? I just want you all to read it for a second and just take it in. And then I'm going to come back to your panelists for some comments in terms of how this tweet makes you feel or how we should respond. And I kind of share it without comments. I'm actually very keen to hear your comments. So, Lanaya, would you like to go first?
I definitely can tell you how I felt the first time I saw that tweet, but I mean, it's rooted in white supremacy. That is a fact, and it's the reason why we need to have, both the importance of, at least at the conversation level, but also for activists to have more intersectional conversations within our community. The only reason that anyone would think that a single day that is linked to a celebration of some kind related to a freedom of slavery is infringing upon the rights of the LGBT community, and an entire month is because that person believes that the gays are white men or the gays are white bodies, and that's not the case, right? This is if we haven't learned anything over the past many weeks or months, that allyship is important. But that tweet is hurtful, but it also reveals what we know within our community to be a problem, which is racism is a problem within the LGBT community. There has been historically an aversion to difference within the LGBT community, right? It's cisgendered, it's white, it's gay, and for that reason, you have trans women of color and other members of our community, their histories and their present experiences suffering from erasure because of individuals like that. So yes, it's an unfortunate tweet, but it's also a rallying cry for those allies who have zero tolerance for this type of thing.
And I agree, it kind of highlights our issues. And just to everyone at home in the audience, by the way, I think a lot of you use the chat function, but can you please send your questions to the Q&A box, is what I think you call it. I'm not that technically minded, unfortunately. Pedro, any comments on that tweet?
Yeah, I mean, I would second what Lanaya said, of course. And the other thing I would add is, if there's one thing we've learned this time, this was a big wake-up moment, was that there's a lot of self-education that needs to happen. Look, this tweet is hateful. It's very easy to focus our energy at hating this tweet. I will be on the front line of doing that. I'll be, the #1 guy who wants to take down that tweet. However, more dangerous are all the other tweets that are not as explicit like this one.
Yeah.
And those are equally about white supremacy. Those are equally revelatory of white fragility. And those reveal a significant amount of ignorance about racism. It reveals ignorance about where a white person positioned themselves in the racism spectrum. And importantly, it reveals something that has always been very shocking to me, ignorance about US history. I mean, the one thing that shocks me the most is this division or this split between US history and African-American history. African-American history is US history, just to be clear. It is US history. It's not, and by having this split, it's almost as if, well, actually having this split confirms the segregation over which the US society, and I would say Western colonizing society, was built. There is a world for one people and another world for other people. You learn US history over here, and then you learn African-American history over here as if it was a different planet. So again, this tweet is revelatory of all these things. And I look at it from a positive standpoint. And I want to believe that what this incites is people to say, we'll have to learn a lot more. We have to educate a lot more.
And even, I don't really want to refer to who he is, but his comment around trying to colonize Pride Month, I sometimes have an issue with Pride Month, Black History Month, because I'm very much like, it should be Pride every day. We should be celebrating Black people every day. International Women's Day in March, we should be celebrating women every day. It shouldn't just be one day. I get there needs to be there's two schools of thought in that regard. Keisha, I think you wanted to say something.
We have Pride Month because of trans women of color, period.
Exactly. First person that threw the brick and started the movement for civil rights for our community, and we can't forget that.
And it was a riot.
Yeah, it was. But how can we build bridges across communities? Because perhaps people of color might say, well, actually, what LGBT community might say is there's a lot of homophobia within the ethnic minority community or people of color community. What do we say to that? How do we build bridges? Does anyone have any suggestions? Keisha.
I think it's about presence with each other, right? And I think it's about dialogue. You can't learn about people and appreciate other perspectives and be empathetic and listen from over there. You have to be present with each other, and you have to be willing to listen with each other. I think, the idea that because you're from the gay community, you're somehow inoculated from white supremacy is a myth, right? To Pedro's point, all of us were educated in a U.S. education system that did not teach African-American history, that did not teach the rich history that we brought to this country and the rich history that we continue to provide to the U.S. And on the other side of that, other people are not aware of the rich history of the LGBTQ plus community and what we've provided to this country and any country we've occupied. So I think the answer is about learning. The answer is about talking to each other and a dialogue with each other.
Yeah, I think Robert was going to say something as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on Keisha's point. The thing that I find both encouraging, but at the same time discouraging, is the desire to divide rather than to come together against a common purpose. And to me, the one thing that we need to have in common is to be authentic, to be present, to really truly listen to each other. And even if we have differences, which we should and will, to celebrate them, but on the same score, recognize that this fight for equality and justice for all is the one common thread that can unite us. And if we bring the full power of that together, then the ability to affect change for everyone will be much more present for all of us. And I've just been struck here, even, speaking to many of my friends and colleagues who have participated in the Black Lives Matter protests, and frankly, people from all different walks of life who have come together, and when really probed, like, why, it really does come down to a very simple principle, which is that we're all fighting for justice. And if we can align around that and allow for differences and be open and present and hear and be comfortable with differences, then we can still come together on the platform that matters the most, which is equality. And that's what I think unifies us all.
And we're all one community. What we've learned is we can't be complacent about our rights, because although the Supreme Court ruled for protections federally, like you say, the small businesses, there are no protections, but then the healthcare rights for trans people are being eroded. So I feel like we always have to be on our guard. It's so annoying. We just want to be treated like everyone else. We just want equality. I'm going to change tack slightly. And I thought, Lanaya, I'll come to you, because given the fact, I want to talk about leadership. Because given the fact that we're in a crisis, everyone is working remotely, you're the president at the Center for Talent Innovation. Would love to hear about some themes that you're hearing about changing leadership styles in a crisis and how people are managing in a crisis.
Well, I mean, managing in a crisis or two, I definitely, we've had obviously many conversations with chief diversity officers and business leaders during this time. And, many have been trying to work to focus on their people, and obviously during the global, kind of health crisis, or the emergence of that earlier in this year, it was very reactive, right? And I think it's been a long several months, and leaders now realize it's going to require kind of tireless leadership, right? Persistent leadership. What we've observed, and it's similar to what has already been mentioned, is early on, it's been getting more comfortable with courageous conversations or opening up space for dialogue within the organization. That's been kind of critical for leaders and organizations. Similar to what we heard, as it relates to just allyship within our community, it requires listening, right? Ensuring your employees are seen and heard, and of course we've been approached about facilitating moderated conversations on race and town halls and things of that nature with members of our task force. But even for those who are, doing this internally within their orgs, this is a new test of leadership, right? You have to understand, employees are coming into the workplace or into virtual settings, bringing tremendous trauma, right, and grief, and which is different, right? If you think about it, on the back of this, the health crisis, obviously severe economic or rapid downturn, you had millions of people, who'd experienced death, rapid human loss, unemployment, and then obviously on the the backs of murder at the hands of police. You have people bringing something very emotional, very painful into work interactions, right? And so what might have been normal for a leader, they realize there's a more human component that they actually need to sharpen. And they've also been, it's interesting. There's one executive we were having a conversation with, and the challenge was not really knowing the best way to engage their leadership team or encourage their leadership team to act. And it came back to this is, if any time from a leadership, this is the moment you sit in some discomfort, right? This may be the moment that you actually reveal some vulnerability, because your teams would much rather you show up imperfectly rather than not show up at all, right?
Yeah,
and
agreed.
While the external statements are extremely important, I have opinions about that too. It's important for leaders now to take stock, internally, dismantle bias within their own walls, right? Lean into what they can do, whether it's being intentional about hiring, development, promotion. So I think it's a human-centered type of leadership that some companies are testing for the very first time.
Yeah.
And then for those that are more equipped, it's just an opportunity for them to be intentional about change, right?
I like the term human-centered leadership. I think that's really, really key. I mean, how do we think the inclusion agenda specifically will be altered by what's happening with the pandemic and remote working? Do we think priorities will shift? Pedro, let's come to you.
Well, for some companies have been relying on hiring and on attrition to make the change happen. They were counting on growth of business to expand jobs and being able to fill out that jobs with a more representative group of employees, or they were hoping that attrition was going to happen in a rapid evolving, booming economy to be able to get to representation targets that would be in line with their aspirational goals. And I think the downturn that is undoubtedly coming our way is going to create a challenge. We'll have to double down more on progression, on plans on what does progression inside, doing the zigzag career development in order to start upskilling the underrepresented group employees to prepare for a bigger chance if and when it appears and when economy starts recovering again. It's going to be a huge challenge. I don't think there's going to be a solution. Certainly, growth used to be a great platform to be in terms of starting to fill out jobs for faster representation. So I'm concerned, and I don't have a solution.
Yeah. Keisha, any comments on the changing inclusion agenda?
For me and my company, it isn't a change in the agenda. It's a push forward with the agenda. To echo on some of Pedro's comments, we'd already included professional development in what we were thinking about in terms of moving the needle in our organization. And we have a program called Advancing Women Leaders. And it's just become more important that we continue with that program virtually. And one of the pieces of that program is a sponsorship framework, a sponsorship setup using CTI to guide us through that. And it's more important than ever that we keep going with that agenda. So for us, for my company, we're not changing, we're leaning into what we planned for and pushing forward with it.
Yeah. So sorry, Robert, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to just build on the points that have been made. And, I found it interesting, Suki, that you put that tweet up. We've been having inside CBI, which, frankly, Constellation Brands is a progressive company within a very conservative industry. You want to talk about underrepresentation in beverage alcohol, very few Black African Americans, very few, Latino, Hispanic, Latina very few LGBTQ identified people, women completely underrepresented. I mean, it is just an industry that for lots of structural reasons has not made the progress necessary. But what I would say has been the really interesting catalyst that's come from the social unrest that's occurred, and especially the pain and suffering and enragement and exhaustion, I think, among the Black community in particular, is a much more authentic dialogue. And I'll tell you the number of questions that I've gotten directly about what about, and the concept of it just makes me crazy, but it's an instructive opportunity. What about reverse discrimination? You guys are so focused on all of the underrepresented groups. What about the opportunities for, straight white males? And most executives would avoid that conversation, but I think it's so critical to lean into it and to say, you need to be the best candidate. And underrepresented groups are underrepresented for a reason. And it's because they've never been given a seat at the table, even if they're imminently more qualified than other candidates that have been put into roles. So if you want to be the best candidate and you're a straight white male, then understand how to be a leader of all people.
Absolutely.
Understand how to open the aperture up to the candidates that deserve to be in leadership positions so that we can affect change in the culture by inviting them to the process. And look, I'll give you an example. I had very little to do with it, but introducing her. We recently hired a Black trans woman into a critical role in our operations group because she was the most qualified for the role. But had she not been introduced to the executive team there, they wouldn't have known her and she wouldn't have been given that opportunity. Yeah. So I think we all have an obligation as leaders to make sure that we do that and that we coach and have empathy for our majority peers that may not have the experience or the confidence to actually lead in that way and to help them.
I mean, I have a lot to say on the straight white men that feel neglected, and I'm sure Lanaya has something to say, so I'm going to pass it to her rather than me saying something. Lanaya, what would you say to the straight white guys that feel left behind?
Well,
keep it clean.
Yeah, no, of course. No, what I would say is that they have to understand that they have been the center of most every conversation in workplace, right? And so it's not a zero-sum game, right? It's not, well, we hire this woman, then there's no role for you. And I think it's interesting because we actually are launching a study in about a month focused on majority men. And so we'll get a nice look into belonging for cisgendered white men, straight cisgender white men, to try to get at some of these feelings, right? But it is one of those things, I think, from a visibility standpoint, there's always been that visibility, right? If you're a cisgendered white man, straight or passing, and queer, what we do know now is that, yes, Black professionals, communities of color, there are greater demands on them to demonstrate their credibility, right? We know that Black professionals are 4 times as likely to say they've experienced discrimination at work. People of color oftentimes communities of color, suffer from lack of access to sponsors. And obviously, there are organizations leaning into sponsorship, but 1/5 of Black professionals, 15% of Asian professionals, not only do they have lack of access to senior executive advocates, they say not a single manager knows them by name, right? So imagine being rendered invisible in connection to power, the long-term effects on one's career. So yeah, I mean, I'd have a lot to say with someone who felt that way, but I'm sure it would be a productive conversation if we had it one-on-one.
Mine is just like, poor you, and then I normally move on. So let's go to the next question. We're going to talk about, because obviously it's Pride Month, you've got the rainbow logo being used on lots of brands for companies all over the world. And there's been controversies in the past in terms of some of the brands having the logo, but they're not necessarily representing the LGBT inclusion within their business. So I'd love to get some perspectives from the panel about using the rainbow flag for a company brand. Robert, should we start with you?
Sure. Look, I'll just be very straightforward on this topic. I I feel like we can argue in the margins about things like this. And while I recognize the importance of symbolism, I have to tell you that every day when I receive the crazy plethora of incoming emails that I receive from my colleagues, and at the bottom of every one of them is the Stellar Pride logo and the flag, there's a unifying aspect to that is heartening to me. And I recognize there are different views on this topic in the community, and I respect them. But on the same score, back to, I think, the point that we were talking about earlier, is if we look for what is common versus always focusing on what is different, and we recognize that if our values are rooted in seeking equality and justice and opportunity and security for all, then I am super comfortable with companies and with my colleagues leveraging the rainbow flag as a method of demonstrating their solidarity. And look, in many ways, a lot of the early businesses that supported the LGBTQ community were a part of our fight to achieve equality and justice. And so the backlash against businesses trying to co-opt, this battle, I think, is, for me personally, a bit misguided. I do think that at times companies can overplay it, and I think work in a way which isn't authentic to the cause, and that needs to be called out. But ultimately, I think, the majority, I'll call it, say the 80% majority are really there trying to do the right thing and provide support and connection and dialogue to the community.
Well, even the shirt I'm wearing tonight, as you can see, it has the rainbow. This is from Burberry from a few seasons ago. It was Christopher Bailey's last collection when he was the CEO, and he dedicated it to the queer community. And so he had the rainbow flag running through pretty much lots of the garments in the collection. And the great thing about someone like that doing that, if you think about Burberry and where they sell their products, China, Middle East, Russia, he kind of overlooked all commercial implications because it was his last collection and he wanted to do something really good for the community, and he made a huge donation from the sales to 3 nonprofits globally for the LGBT community. So I think it can be used for good, but sometimes I feel companies can't win. Sometimes when they do use the rainbow flag and try to do something good, they get criticized, but if they don't, they will then also get criticized because they're not supporting the LGBT community. Pedro, do you have anything to add on this subject?
No, I 100% second what Robert was saying and what you were saying as well. I have 2 points of view on this one. The first one is the controversy resolves itself, because if companies are hypocritical about it, in this day and age of transparency through social media, people pick it up in a heartbeat. Yeah. And the famous backlash Robert was talking about happens. And that backlash may produce the change inside those companies that was much needed, in fact. So there's that. But the second part I always think about is, if I wish when I was 12 or 14, I wish I was walking on the street and my retail bank was being hypocritical about the flag. And I wish my butter brand was being hypocritical about the flag. And I wish my supermarket down the road was hypocritical about it. I wish I was surrounded by that flag. I just imagine the level of support and the level of confidence that would have given me back then. Because when I was 14 or 8 or 17 or 13, I was not really into understanding activism in detail. And I would argue, if any teenager nowadays really understands whether brand A, in the way they treat their own employees, is fully compatible with the values of promoting LGBTQ communities. People may not know that, but there are so many young people that they feel so much, and they draw so much support and so much energy from seeing the logos everywhere. And I think that is more important than anything else. And as I said, if there's backlash because the community picks up on things, they will give a hard time to the companies, and chances are, as I said, the companies will change.
Agreed. We've got a really good question from someone. They didn't give their name, so it's an anonymous question. Can a more remote working environment lead to greater inclusion for LGBTQ plus employees, or are there more cons than pros? Keisha, let's go with you first.
I'm not sure, I'm really not sure. This is really new for all of us in this, at least for my firm, and certainly in financial services, right? It's come to work, sit behind your desk. So at first blush, I think it could be beneficial, but it remains to be seen how this will work out for minority communities of all shapes and colors, right?
Yeah, because I think the LGBT, I think it also depends on your scenario at home, because actually sometimes going to work is your safe space, because you may not be able to be yourself, particularly when you factor in the intersections of race, religion. Actually being at home, there is a lot more closeted LGBT people because they feel they can't come out. And when we talk about trying to create that iconic culture, I think that's a lot harder to do remotely. And when you think about values from my perspective don't mean anything because they're words. It's the behaviors that underpin them that I think are more important, because you see the behaviors. Does anyone have anything to say about how iconic cultures can be built remotely? Robert?
You know what, Suki, I tend to be an optimist on these topics. And I think one of the things that I've noticed in working remotely is how much more intimately I actually know the employees that work in the organization, because it's difficult and we're all working from home, and not everyone has the opportunity to have the space to isolate their professional life from their whole life. And it's opened up so many interesting discussions. I mean, such different contexts, from, a underrepresented, group, somebody who's single working in a small apartment, to somebody who's at home working with their family and hiding their true identity for lots of different reasons. What I've found actually is a level of empathy that has occurred across so many people to recognize the whole human being, and even to understand the hidden signals when someone's suppressing something, whether it's suppressing their sexual identity, whether it's suppressing their fact that they're trying to be a parent at the same time as working, and they're being disrupted. There's been such an interesting, I think, encouraging and emotionally present willingness to open ourselves up to our employees, because we see it. It's on film, it's right there in front of us, and you can feel it. It's quite interesting to me, and I've heard this from so many different people that I'm hopeful we can bring that to the workplace when we're physically back together again, which can at times be quite transactional.
Can I lay a motion that we should all put Robert forward as Biden's running mate? Can we do that?
I second it.
Yay, there we go. You should see, look, loads of people are raising their hands.
I don't think that would be a good case, but I really do appreciate that endorsement.
It's probably not paying enough anyway, Robert. I wouldn't worry about it. So, does anyone else have any comments on that about LGBT inclusion remotely? Lanaya, anything to say there?
Yeah, no, it's, you bring up a good point, but then also there's opportunity for the optimism on, the point about kind of safety and being outed. One thing that becomes top of mind for me, and CTI, we actually did a global, done several studies around the LGBT community, but a global study a couple years back, and they offer that framework, and several of you may be aware of it, but it's basically when in Rome, embassy, and an advocate, right? And so the when in Rome is, for large multinationals kind of operating in jurisdictions where, they're required to adhere to local norms and laws. And then there's the embassy model, which more companies actually operate in this space, which is where, the companies still enforce pro-LGBT policies, norms, as it relates to benefits, ERGs. They treat their corporate office as an embassy, right? While they might not protect the employee, the LGBTQ employee outside of that glass tower, they actually do have this validating space and equal kind of rights as an employee within the corporate walls. And then there's advocacy model, obviously, when they're reaching out. But the point is, what happens when there's no embassy, right? That's what I've been kind of warring with over the past couple of months. But then at the same time, I've spoken to several organizations, those in tech and elsewhere, who realize, okay, well, we actually can be highly productive in this remote work environment. We've proven that. we've deployed all of the tech and kind of tested it through, maybe we don't need to have, kind of Black talent or queer talent or other move to Silicon Valley. Maybe we can actually tap them in Chicago or Atlanta or London or South Africa. Maybe there are different ways for us to work. And I think that can only benefit the LGBTQ community, especially in cultures. Wall Street, there would have never been a time that you thought that we would be doing all of our work from home. It was a FaceTime culture. If you weren't on a plane, you're on the desk. That's the way it works. And now there are organizations that I've heard are thinking of getting rid of 25% of their commercial real estate space, meaning they're going to adopt in an industry that doesn't even think about this.
Yeah.
And so this might be good for those who don't fit a corporate culture, right? For the trans community, for folks who, I want to wear my natural hair, I want to do X, Y, and Z, and I actually can still deliver for the firm. So I'm optimistic because companies are talking about it.
So, I mean, so we only have a few minutes left. So I'm going to come to you one by one to ask you what your Pride message of hope will be. Now, I know it wasn't on the question, so I know I'm going off script. So you're going to have to think creatively while I think about something to say. But no, I think it's been a fantastic conversation so far, and we really appreciate you all joining us today. So your message of hope for Pride, Lanaya, I'm going to come back to you. You go first. You don't have very long.
No, it'll be quick. My message of hope is, let's be good to one another. That's it.
Yeah, exactly. Here. Pedro, over to you.
Pride is for everyone. It really is for everyone. It's not for just white guys showing their muscles on Pride. It's for everyone.
Exactly. Fantastic. Robert?
I'll answer within the sort of business context, Suki, because I think it's so critical to create economic opportunity, but to recognize that we have an obligation to helm the organizations that we're associated with in a way that combines economic opportunity with being a force for positive social change. And I'm so hopeful because of the fact that we're dealing with 3 crises concurrently, that it will bring us together and humanize us and help us recognize we have to leverage the power that we have to affect positive change and to create that opportunity for everyone.
Absolutely. I'm sure Robert's going to go into politics. He's lying. Keisha, over to you.
I would say quickly, get out and vote. We are the change. Yes. We can create the change we need.
Absolutely. Honestly, all I wanted to say was kind of along the lines of Robert saying is that we all have to recognize our privilege, even as an LGBT person, and there are lots of underprivileged people in the world, particularly our community. So I sit on the board of Outright Action International, which is a global human rights charity alongside Robert and Lanaya. And I'm also a patron for AKT in the UK that looks after LGBT homeless youth. My ask would be for you to go onto their website, donate money if you can. They need money to give it to our community to help them. So if you can spare any more money, you're saving money by not being out and about in the prides and in the marches buying merchandise. So why don't you spend that money and give it to a charity or a non-profit that could really help our community? So all this stuff, I'm sorry that we're not getting a huge round of applause because we don't have a big audience. We have a big audience at home, but a huge thank you to our panelists for sharing their insights so honestly. I really, really appreciate you giving your time. Thank you so much. Remember everyone that it is still a pandemic. So please be safe. COVID-19 is still out there. It's important to be safe, but it's also important to be fabulous. See you all later, everyone. Bye.